Thank you for joining today's webinar, and at this time, I'd like to turn it over to Bill.
Great, thanks, Michelle. Good morning, everyone. Welcome to HBK's monthly risk advisory webinar series that we do on the fourth Wednesday of each month. My name is Bill Heaven. I'm a senior director here at HBK in our risk advisory practice. And again, thanks for joining us today. This morning, we're going to walk through and the PCI DSS version 4.0, what's new. All right, so here's today's agenda. Just 4 areas. We'll talk about the history, the specifics, version 4.0 changes, and then do a wrap up. A few housekeeping issues. Our presentation this morning is eligible for 1 hour of CPE credit. In order to obtain that credit, you have to stay online during the entire presentation, and there's going to be 4 embedded questions throughout the presentation that you'll have to answer to show us that you're still on the webinar. And then we've muted all the incoming lines, but we are monitoring the message chat window. So if you still can chat, you can put a message into us, and Michelle is keeping an eye on that. Additionally, if the presentation starts acting up for you, the first thing you should try is just to refresh the browser, and that typically will resolve any issues that you're having. There's going to be a PDF copy of the slides that's available for you to download as well. We're going to be sending out a copy of the slide deck and a link to a recording of the webinar later this week. So keep those things in mind. This slide that's up right now are our learning objectives, which are related to our being able to offer the continuing education. So these are the 5 things that basically are your takeaways from this morning's webinar. This is my bio. Again, I have a dual role here at HBK. If you've attended any webinars in the past, I handle the firm's internal IT security responsibilities, as well as work with external clients. And I've got a polling question to start us off today. I just want to kind of get an idea of where people are at with PCI DSS. So if you wouldn't mind, just give me an ABC answer on this, just to give me a little bit of idea where the audience is today. We've got about 70% of people answering. So a few more seconds here. Right. Almost 80%. So let's see what our results are. Okay, so we've got a little more than 60% that don't accept payment cards or do accept payment cards but are not a merchant. So that's good because not many of you have to worry about PCI. So that's probably a good thing, because PCI can be kind of stressful because there's all kinds of requirements through the 12 requirements that they have. So let's keep going here and start going on with our first agenda item and go through some of the history of PCI. All right, so seems like forever ago, but our first e-commerce site was launched in the early 1980s, and then that brought into, online shopping seems like such a thing that's, we all do it probably almost every day. but it's only been around for since the 80s. But when online shopping started coming on, that's when we started getting payment card fraud. And back in the late 90s, Visa and MasterCard reported $750 million in online fraud. So that led Visa to put its toe in the water and try to figure out how to get some security standards around digital payments so it could actually start to help protect itself from all the fraud that it was experiencing. So then that's really the precursors to the invention of PCI DSS. So for those of you that want to do CPE, just give me an answer to these questions. Here's your first one out of 4. The fourth one is just going to be a yes, no, that I want CPE or I don't. I don't technically require that you answer the questions correctly, but give it your best shot, and hopefully you won't find it too difficult. So Michelle, when it looks like we've got a fair amount of our audience responding, you can go ahead and advance the slide for me. Okay, thank you, Michelle. All right, so let's move on, dig in a little bit more about our PCI history. So as I said, Visa was the first of the card brands to start to try to put some regulation in place. And the actually PCI itself is just totally administered by the card brands. And it was started by these 5 brands here: Amex, Discover, JCB, MasterCard, and Visa. These 5 card brands are also known as the PCI Security Standards Council. And some people may think that PCI is a regulation. It is actually not. It's managed and required by these 5 card brands, but it's not technically a regulation. But keep in mind that a lot of the state regulatory things that are coming out piggyback on top of PCI DSS, and they'll say that the regulation will say that you have to do certain things as required by PCI. So it's technically not a regulation, but it's impacted and involved in a lot of regulations. So PCI has only been around officially for a little bit less than 20 years now. Version 1.0, as if you remember, I said that e-commerce basically began in the 80s, and then the fraud really ramped up by the late 90s. But version 1 of PCI came out in 04, some minor releases in 06 and 08, and then version 2 came about in 2010. So basically I'll go through this. We got version 3, same thing, 5. So we're looking 5 to 8 years is somewhere when they do these major releases. And when I click here and go to version 4, that again was about 8 years, from 18 to 24, 6 years. So version 4 was actually announced in 2022. It went into effect back in April of 2024 with about a handful of requirements, and then there are future data requirements which go into effect basically April 1st of 2025. And so those future data requirements are not technically a requirement until next April, but they are considered best practice. So you're still supposed to follow them, but they don't technically go in effect until April 1st of 2025. Here's our second poll question. And Michelle, when it looks like everybody's catching up on that, just advance the slide for me. Okay, thanks, Michelle. All right, so let's talk a little bit about the PCI specifics. So this slide here, again, the founding members there, the data security standard, 5 brands. Those are the people that basically own PCI. They've set up the PCI Standards Council, which is technically the unit made up of those 5 brands that come out with the PCI requirements, the annual certification type requirements, and the entities themselves. So you've got card issuers, which are the 5 brands, acquiring banks, which the banks that administer a lot of the credit cards. You actually have card holders, which are the people that own, the credit card issuers. Those 5 brands give the credit cards to the card holders. Then on the bank side, you got merchants, and then you got service providers. So all 5 of those entities roll up under PCI DSS. And then PCI has 4 reporting levels. So based on the number of credit card transactions that a company processes on an annual basis, determines what level they're under. With the smallest being 20,000 payment card. And I say payment card instead of credit card because you've got technically credit cards and debit cards, and then you can even use gift cards on some websites that it's like a prepaid gift card. So you got these 4 levels, one being the largest and having the most restrictions as far as how you get, and I'll talk about compliance and how the requirements between those 4 levels come into play. But again, 6 million payment card transactions annually versus 20,000 payment card transactions. Notice that level 3 encompasses all of your e-commerce merchants. So if you do e-commerce, you're going to automatically be considered a level 3, even if you don't do 20,000 credit card transactions in a year. These are the 6 control objectives that PCI has put into place. And you can tell, so building and maintaining a secure network ties out to requirement 1 and 2, protecting account data 3 and 4, maintaining a vulnerability management program 5 and 6, strong access controls requirement 7, 8, and 9, and regularly monitoring and testing your networks 10 and 11, and then the security policy is requirement 12. So we'll go into these in a little bit more detail. I'll come out with the 12 actual requirements. So here's the first 6, which these have been in place since back in the early version 1.0, and they just keep adding requirements to them. They grow. I think it's version 4 added 64 requirements, I believe. And that's the details. And I'll talk before you got to high, and then there's sections, and it goes down and down, but it gets, it's pages. I think it's about 50 some pages of requirements now over the 12 high level, which you've got the firewall, vendor support password, cardholder data, encrypting transmissions, protecting against malware, developing and maintaining secure applications. Second set of 6 to make up our 12. Keeping access to cardholder data only to those for need to know. Sometimes you'll also hear that. Reback, role-based account control, access control, identifying authentication, restricting access, tracking and monitoring, testing, and coming up with an information security policy and maintaining that. And then there's also an appendix of which you've got 3 appendices that came out dealing with multi-tenant service providers, previously known as shared service providers. A2 appendix deals with secure socket layer and TLS for card present, and then point of interface terminal connections, which came about into 2015. And then our designated entity special validations, what came about in 16. So I talked about require compliance validation. So again, when I spoke earlier, you have the 4 levels, starting with level 1 up to 6 million credit card or payment card transactions, down to level 4, which is needing a pretty small mom and pop, but still needing to do their self-assessment questionnaire. So if you're a level 1 merchant, they have to validate your compliance with PCI through bringing in an independent qualified security assessor, which is controlled by PCI on what their capabilities are and that they're up to speed to where they should be. If you're a level 2, the next level down, you can do it yourself, but you have to pass PCI requirements to be an internal security assessor. Then if you're level 3 or 4, you can do self-assessment questionnaires. And I've got a slide coming up on the next one that talks about the different layers. I think there's about 8 different types of self-assessment questionnaires, but you either do it yourself or you have somebody come in to validate your compliance, and then you have to complete what's called an AOC, or an attestation of compliance, to tell PCI that you've looked at their regular requirements and you are indeed following all of them and are in compliance. These are your SAQ options if you're doing level 3 or 4 yourself, or actual level 2 for the internal security assessors doing this as well. So again, there's different requirements based on what type of SAQ you are. If you're fully outsourced the PCI DSS, there's only 29 requirements, similar to if you're using one of these point-to-point encryption devices where you don't have to follow a lot. But if you are unlucky enough to follow in a SAQ-D, you have 234 requirements to follow. So big difference if you're point-to-point encryption versus SAQ-D. So those are things that you have to keep in mind. What I always would recommend to people is to do your best to scope. So your cardholder data environment, or CHD, is outside of PCI, so you're not considered a merchant, and you don't do anything e-commerce or on a website, and you pass all that through to the service provider and let them be the merchant, and so you don't have to worry about PCI, would be my recommendation. That if you have a choice, do it that way. And then here's our next CPE question. Michelle, if people are, there you go, thanks. All right, so let's talk a little bit about the version 4 changes. Like I said earlier, there's version 4 implemented 64 new requirements. So that if we go back, so that's going to put us, I'll have to do a double check on that to see if that 234 was with or without those 64 new requirements. But version 4 was a lot of version 4 has got a lot of things where it's changing the scope, and it's doing a lot of things to quote unquote clarify. So they've renamed some classifications of software, made some changes to various things, but it talks a lot about scoping and what you have to do, and it clarifies a lot of stuff. So I'll go through some of the high level, and then we'll get into we'll go through those 12 requirements, and I'll tell you what is required to be implemented for 2024 and what is for next year. But again, if it's a 2025, then they still want you to do it, and it's considered a best practice. But version 4 is definitely in effect now. The version 3.2.1 or what has been officially retired. So the terminology changes that have come into play, you've got account data, which it replaces some of the payment card account and things. It's all called account data now. And so then you've got card verification, or this is security code, typically what you'll see on websites, but it got the different acronyms. You got your CAV2, CVV2, CID, security code. It's all now called a card verification code. So they've clarified the terminology on that. Added 2 classifications of software, bespoke, which is developed for an entity by a third party based on the entity specification. So you're telling them what to do, versus custom software where you're developing by yourself, for yourself. And then changed malware from requirement 5. It's now called malicious software. Shared hosting provider or shared service provider is now called a multi-tenant service provider. Network security controls instead of just firewall, because as we move out to cloud computing and virtualization, it makes more sense to, the firewall is a broader thing, and so they're just calling it network security control. Trusted network is your internal, and then untrusted is a cool name for the internet. So just a lot of terminology changes there. And then we also, version 4 also changed some of the structure requirements. So you've got a requirement. So there's actually 15 now. You've got requirement 1 to 12, and then the 3 appendices that I talked about earlier. And then it drops down to a section where that's going to be section 1.1 or section 12.1. And then you've got your individual requirements where it's, if you're section 1.1 dot individual requirements, so it could go 1.1.1 to 1.1 whatever, and then so on and so forth, to, if you're up to requirement 12, you might have 12.1 or 12.6.1.1. So it's formalizing the hierarchy between the requirements, the sections, and then the individual requirements. Then we're going to go into, for the next probably 12, 14 slides here, just talk about some of the actual changes that are going into effect for PCI version 4.0. So this is, again, you don't have to write or try to keep up with these. These are all in the presentation slide deck that you can get later on, but I'll just go and highlight these, try to do it at a high level. So requirement 1, which is network security control, formerly a firewall. You've got 3 changes that go into effect immediately, but you've got your 1.1, a lot of terminology changes between untrusted and trusted. Again, your internal network versus the internet. Version or requirement 1.2 makes the DMZ, or the demilitarized zone, is no longer a direct requirement. And then section 1.4 talks about cardholder data environment. So changes there. This is the hardening requirement. So there were no significant changes. This is the only area of the 12 that had no significant changes. So moving on to requirement changes on 3 is our storage requirement. So we had 2 immediate changes go into effect and 3 changes that go into effect April 1st, 2025. And section 3.4 deals with your PAN number, which is basically your credit card number and all its expiration date and CVV, credit card security numbers, as well as 3.5, which deals with some specifics on truncation, to which that is basically when you see when they made changes to the, if you remember, we used to print the full credit card number on receipts, and then truncation came into play. I'm not sure what version it did, but then when they masked the credit card, so truncation is just a different word for masking your credit card, so that people can't grab your receipt from a restaurant or from a trash can and get your whole credit card number. So that's section 3.5. And then there's 3 changes that go into effect for 2025, being able, 3.4 deals with copying and pasting when you're on a remote session, prevents that from happening. Section 3.5 of requirement 3 on storage deals with cryptology, so that's hashes and encryption. So there's some specifics with that. And then requirement section 3.7 again deals with cryptography and encryption, and making that the fact that you have to have different encryption keys based on if you're in production or non-production. So it doesn't use the same. So basically, somebody can't accidentally get access to your non-production environment and then get an encryption key that they could use to unencrypt sensitive credit card holder data in your production environment. So just some specifics there. Requirement 4 for transmission of credit card data is only one change there, and that's our 2025 change, which deals with the credit card, the PAN number, which is your number and your expiration date and the card security information, and then the trusted keys that you use to encrypt that data when you're going to transmit it around the internet. So that's requirement number 4. Requirement number 5 has 4 changes. And some of these requirements, like multiple parts to the same section. So we've got 4, again, 2025 changes, not anti-malware, and that is the area. Section 5.2 deals with the frequency that you have to identify the components that are not at risk based on the malware, based on risk assessment. Section 5.3 has 2 requirements, which is the frequency that you do your scanning for malware, and then also scanning removable media. So if you have anything where you're taking a drive off site, you gotta be very careful with that. You see that in the news all the time. But if you're using a thumb drive, make sure that that's being scanned, because that's a way to bring malware into the environment, and that's malware getting into the environment that's how you can get stuff to basically steal data out of your cardholder PCI environment. If you go back, way back to the target breach, that's basically what happened there was malware got put into a third-party vendor, and so that's why requirement 5.3 is important. And then section 5.4 requires you to use certain tools to basically protect you against phishing. So it's not just telling people that they can't fall into a phish and why they shouldn't fall for it. This is actually implementing some tools to help you fight that phishing battle. Since I think the last time I looked, phishing accounted for well over 80% of all cyber attacks, which PCI attacks would fall into that as well. Requirement 6 for securing systems and applications. We've got 2 changes that are in effect now, and then 2 more that come into effect April 1st of 2025. And those changes are basically the current ones in 6.2 is around your system development lifecycle, where we talked about the changes to the bespoke, where it's being developed for an entity by someone else, and the custom, where you're developing it for yourself, any software changes. And then a terminology change in requirement 6.5, requirement 6, section 6.5, I should say, where your test environment is now referred to as pre-production. Some of the changes to 4.0 are just, name changes, so it's not a big deal, but there are some, a lot of things requirement like MFA we'll get to, where you have to have everybody that has access to the card holders have to have multi-factor authentication. 2025 changes for secure systems and applications is section 6.3, which addresses supply chain attacks, which we go back to the solar winds, that was in 2020, and that was basically people got tricked into thinking they were applying an update for their software, and it was really malware they were installing. And then 6.4 talks about the payment page scripts and making sure you're using the web application firewall, which is basically software firewall instead of brings it closer to the application. Requirement 7. There's one change for now, which talks about moving a database requirement from requirement 8 into 7, and then it expands to include repositories where cardholder data is stored. And then we've got 2 changes for upcoming for next year in section 2. So all 3 of the changes in section 2, but it deals with account access and reviewing who has that access. For next year, you have to do that review once every 6 months. That's a lot of the changes to 4.0 come up with specifics on, you need to do this type of scan in this time period. You need to check this within a year or within 6 months. It's got specifics on frequencies so you have to pay attention to that. And then there's a secondary requirement on section 72, dealing with how often you periodically review things. So again, pay attention to the details. You can download from the PCI standard site. It's got that green PCI logo, so you know you're at the right place, and you can download the actual 4.0 requirements. Moving on to section 8, there's a total of 5 changes, 1 for this year and 4 for next year. So basically the one now is PCI, the password length. It talks about the consistency of the password. Again, it's basically saying But if you've got a lot of consistency in your password for now, then you don't have to change it as frequently. That's what Section 8.3 is saying. Next year, they're going to basically, that same 8.3 section is going to require that the password length is going to move from 7 characters, which is pretty low because typically see at least 8 now, but it's moving it from a length of 7 to a length of 12. And then 8.4, again, I was talking about multi-factor. 8.4 and 8.5 sections deal with MFA, protecting the cardholder environment. On both of those sections, there's requirements now that require that, as well as Section 8.6 that talk about the management of your application and or your system accounts. So you gotta, as far as like overseeing those, checking who has access to them, are gonna fall into version or requirement 8, I should say. Section 9 is getting ahead of myself here. So basically, section physical security, talking about section 9.5 is periodic inspection of POI devices. POI stands for point of interaction. An example would be like a credit card reader. So you have to actually inspect these things to make sure they don't look like they've been tampered with. Here at HBK, so we accept credit cards, but we've scoped the cardholder data environment outside of our network. So we also outsource it all. So we're not considered a PCI merchant, but one of our policies that we have is those readers that we use for the credit cards, we require them to be inspected visually once a month. So people are assigned, that are responsible for those devices, have to look at those and just make sure that there's nothing looks strange with them that they could have been tampered with. This will be, it's not likely to happen in an office environment, but like a place where it could happen and you hear about it a lot is putting skimmers on gas station pumps where they sneak in and put a skimmer device in there so that when you scan your device, it's actually taking that card number off of it and sending it somewhere else. That's something that could be hopefully identified by skimming it, but that's would be an example of a POI device. Moving on to requirement 10. We've got the four changes to 10 and dealing with logging and monitoring. Section 10.7 refers to controls centered around what they refer to as business as usual or BAU, and that if there's control failures in those areas, you have to look for the monitoring. Again, in the future, for 10.4 and 10.7, basically define what a periodic review is and how frequent that has to happen. So those are coming up for April of 2025. And then 10.7 changes that all the entities, when I talked before about merchants and bank acquirers and service providers, everybody has to be worried about that now for monitoring. So it has to, again, some of the specifics in version 4, putting that out for everybody. 11. Let's see, what about winding down to the end here? I notice these requirement changes hopefully aren't getting too dry for you. But 11, dealing with testing. Got two now and 3 next year. So 11.4 basically changed it to from shared service provider to a multi-tenant service provider. And then section 11.5 deals with, you got your intrusion detection and intrusion prevention, and then they group that together along with change detection. So you've got, if you've heard of FIMs or file integrity monitors, it's like software that you can put on your network to look at the file structures to see if any of the portions of the file have changed and stuff. It detects a change a lot faster that, something could be buried deep in the code, and the file integrity monitor will find that. And then in the future changes, 11.3 talks about internal vulnerability scans being required to be authenticated, not just unauthenticated, which is the easier way to run those. IDS and IPS, addressing covert malware channels. And then 11.6 is if you accepted credit cards on an e-commerce site, you have to have a weekly check to check on tampering to make sure that somebody hasn't hacked your payment page and like redirected it somewhere else where they're actually stealing credit cards from you. It's in section 11.6. Requirement 12 has a bunch of changes, and this is the one that deals with having a policy and a program. So you've got basically, you've got 6 changes that went into place now, and then you've got another 8 that are going to go into place next year. So 12.2 deals with acceptable use. 12.3, there are 2 of them. Removes the full previous risk assessment because they've split it up into smaller pieces, and it's peppered through the 12 requirements. And then talk about the second one, and 3 talks about the customized approach. There's two different ways that they've talked about what software was. 12.5 deals with your annual scoping of PCI, reassessing your scope, and re-updating your inventory of what's contained within PCI for your organization. 12.6 is third party to demonstrate compliance. 12.9, I have to take a look at that one. I left that one out of my notes here to update you on. And 12.10 is incident response. So then we'll move on to the changes for next year on requirement 12. So again, there's 8 of them there, 3 under both sections 12.3 and 12.10. So there's talk a lot about flexibility and frequency of when requirements are performed. Cryptology protocols have to be reviewed once every 12 months. Hardware and software technology is reviewed once every 12 months. Service providers documented on section 12.5. So every 6 months you have to look at that, or when you've made significant changes. 12.10, again, dealing with payment page tampering, storage of the PAN or the credit card number and its associated data, and then the frequency of training for your incident response. So again, best practice says your incident response has to have an annual test. So this is along those lines, making that happen. And then this is our last CPU question. So if you want CPU, just go ahead and answer that question. It's the easiest one of the group. All you have to do is say yes or no. I want CPU or I don't. Thanks, Michelle. I'm just going to say people have So let's move into our wrap up. We're got a few minutes left here. We can go over some questions if anything has come in. So, Michelle, do we have any questions?
Oh, yes, we had a couple that were submitted. The first one is, since there are 2024 and 2025 required changes, is version 4 in effect?
Yes, absolutely. Excuse me. Version 4 is indeed in effect. The previous version, which is, let me grab that for you. The previous version was retired as of March 31st. Let me find the exact number here of it. Yeah, so version 321, which came out in May of 2018, was officially retired on March 31st of this year. So there's no longer a version 321 that can be used. So you have to be on version 4.0 now. So even though you're staggered and you have some requirements that are 2024 and some not until April of 2025, there is no doubt that you have to be following PCI version 4. Even if you were on 321 and your scans and everything were done before April 1st, you're technically still required to be on version 4 now. Even so, if something bad would happen, they're going to hold you against version 4's requirements, not 321. So no matter what, you know, I think from the polling question, we didn't have anybody that had to be following PCI because they didn't use it in their business. But if you are one of those organizations that are using PCI or accepting payment cards, you definitely have to be on version 4.0. And the way to look at that is the requirements for next year. They, excuse me, something stuck in my throat. You have to consider those to be best practices. So it would be good if you're doing them this year, but they're not a technical requirement until next year. But 4.0 is still in effect. So don't confuse that because of the split. Part of them this year, part of them next year. I think we got a couple minutes left, Michelle. Any other questions?
Yes, the next question actually ties in to what you just said. How do you treat 2025 required changes?
Yeah, so again, those are, I would, if you can, there's some of those are the more complicated changes for PCI that you have to keep in mind because a lot, like for example, it used to just be the service providers that had to, have a multi-factor authentication to get into the CD or card holder data environment. Now that's everybody has to do multi-factor if they're going to be accessing that. So those are definitely nice to have, but those are some of the more complicated things to implement. So if you are a PCI company that you have to be cognizant of that, definitely don't wait until a few weeks before April 1st, 2025. You probably should have already been working on those, but definitely don't wait any longer and try to get those put in place now so that you don't have any issues. And the way to look at those until the requirement is that they are a best practice. But so again, some of those changes are more complicated, so don't wait till the last minute on those. And so you don't have to struggle with that as the deadline approaches next year. Any other questions, Michelle?
No, that was all.
All right. Well, so that let me wrap it up. So that wraps it up for today's webinar. Hopefully you found that worthwhile. Some of those requirements are, like I said, there's 64 new requirements. So you basically, there's a lot to consider there for PCI version 4.0. a lot of it, there are, like I said, some of those 2025s with passwords changing from 7 characters to 12. That's a big change. Some of the composition of the password, multi-factor authentication for the cardholder data environment. Those are, kind of important and take longer to put into place. But so don't wait on those. But there are a lot of terminology changes, like the untrusted equals internet. So you do have a lot of scoping or clarification in terminology, but then there are some of the more meaty ones which are going to be difficult. So don't overlook, think everything's just terminology changes. There are some important changes in place. And again, I'd like to thank you for attending today's webinar, and then I'll give you a placeholder for next month's webinar, which is one of my the ones I enjoy putting together more because it's very interesting. But if any of you have attended webinars in the past, you know that around this time we do our annual presentation on the Verizon Data Breach Investigations Report, which the Verizon report, I think it's been out there for about 17 years now, and it's released in May. So you can probably already go out and get a copy of the report, but I typically reserve my June webinar for an analysis of that Verizon Data Breach Investigations Report, which is going to be on Wednesday, June 26th, again, 10 a.m., an hour long, and it will be eligible for CPE as well. So we'll get those invites out approximately 1 to 2 weeks before the 26th. So be on the lookout for that. And that's usually a pretty interesting webinar that we do on an annual basis. So if there are no other questions, Michelle, then I'll just sign off and give people a few minutes extra that they can have for their day. So I don't think we have any other questions. So thanks for attending, everyone. Have a great day, and we'll see you on the 26th of June.